Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on mastering second-party audits. Thank you for attending. Before we go any further, just a bit of housekeeping for you. What you'll find is your camera and microphone are automatically turned off, so you can just sit back, relax, and enjoy the content. You will receive an on-demand version of the webinar when the webinar is finished. We are going to hold a Q&A, so please feel free to submit questions, and we will, if we have time, answer as many as we can. If you stay till the end of the webinar, there will be a discount code for our colleagues in TOV Academy. There is some key points on the screen you can see now about the best way of viewing the webinar and asking the questions. So let me introduce the speakers. My name is Rory Button. I'm the Business Development Manager for TOV in the UK. My contact details will be on the webinar at the end. So if you have any questions or want to speak to me about anything, you can. Our speaker today is Richard King-Davis, who has worked with TOV for a long time and is an expert when it comes to auditing. So I will hand over to my colleague shortly, and he will take you through the content today. Just a little bit for anyone that doesn't know TOV, why you should consider using us. We've been going since 1866. We're very proud of our history, and we have years of experience at operating with many different business types across many different solutions. Our aim with our global reach is to make it as easy as possible for you and your supply chain. And our approach is very much about putting you at the heart of what we do and ultimately save you time, mitigate risk, and save you money. So with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Richard, and he will take you through the content today.
Thank you, Rory. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. Just a few words about myself, if I might, just to give you some context. I've been working for TUV Sud now for 25 years, involved in management system certification audits, ISO 9001, TL 9000, ESD 2020, and MasterCard terminal quality management. I've conducted first, second, and third party audits in 59 countries around the world. My whole career has been involved in quality management, compliance, and auditing since I grew up, really. And that's it, really, for that. So let's get stuck in. And first of all, here is a quick agenda for the day. I'm not going to read through all of this, but hopefully we can sort of have a natural progression as to how we would work through a second-party audit of a supplier, right the way through to some of the conclusions and takeaways preceding a Q&A session, as Rory indicated, at the end of the webinar. So, introduction to second-party audits. I suppose the first thing to ask is, what is a second-party audit? I've chosen to take a result of some research and have came across this definition, which is seems to me to be about spot on. It's an audit conducted by a company or its representative on its suppliers or contractors to ensure compliance with contractual obligations, industry standards, or specific requirements. Second-party audits can also be used not just on one supplier, but throughout an entire supply chain. One of the things that we should be trying to think about when we are conducting second-party audits is to strengthen that customer-supplier relationship. So hopefully we also will then eventually get to achieving a greater consistency of performance, quality, and compliance. Also trying to eliminate supply chain risks. There are many industries that use supplier audits, second-party audits, manufacturing, food, safety, pharmaceuticals, to mention three there. But the above is an ideal world scenario, which we'll explore later on during the webinar. So let's also take a quick look to understand what is the difference between a first party, a second party, and a third party audit. A first party audit is typically an internal audit. It can be conducted by an external organisation, but typically it's an audit conducted by an organisation on itself. A second party audit we've just defined in the previous slides, whereas a third party independent audit is a lot of what we do at TUV, which is the certification audits, and it's a third party implies that the organisation that's conducting the audit is impartial and independent of the organisation being audited, so that hopefully we can provide an unbiased assessment of a company's compliance with industry standards or any regulatory requirements. Okay, so the intent of second-party audits can be one or more of the following, and the following list is not exclusive, but it's one of them is to ensure compliance with contractual requirements. Is the supplier doing what they're supposed to be doing? Also understanding how the supplier is performing. Also making sure that we've got alignment between the organisation, the standards and values within the supplier as well. Such things as sustainability is very important in this day and age. Also, we're trying to mitigate the risks in the supply chain, not just within one supplier, but within the supply chain. We want to make sure that if there are any regulations or directives that need to be considered, that they're being complied with as well. For instance, Roche and we. And again, it's to enhance that customer-supplier relationship. I said in the earlier slide, in an ideal world, but if second-party audits are not planned, conducted and reported on appropriately, a second-party audit can achieve exactly the opposite of what was intended. And the part of this webinar today is to try to allow for success during those second-party audits so that we can achieve those objectives. There are 5 discrete steps, but they can run concurrently with one another. Defining the objective of the audit is perhaps one of the most important things, as in what we're trying to achieve. Then we have defining the audit scope, communicating and agreeing audit objectives with the suppliers, development of an audit checklist and an audit plan, scheduling the audit and providing notice. There might be more than one supplier to be considered, though, if one is doing a supply chain audit, one supplier of a supply chain, whereby we need to make sure that the audits are scheduled in a logical fashion. So let's talk about step 1 first, which is defining what we're trying to achieve. And it's a vital step, because if we're not actually defining what it is that we actually want to achieve through the audit, then the audit is doomed to have less than a perfect result, to say the least. And it is that what are we trying to achieve question that needs to be asked. And there are several factors to consider when defining the objective of an audit. One of the first ones is, do we have a contractual right to audit a supplier? If there's no contractual right between the supplier and the customer to conduct an audit, sometimes that can be very difficult to set up and allow a second-party audit to happen. There's also risks need to be considered as well. Is the audit activity, for instance, the best way of getting the information that we need or desire to help our stakeholders within the organisation? Is there a risk in harming the existing supplier-customer relationships? And there can also be other potential risks that needed to be considered. And one of the ones that I've come across a few times in the past is a potential audit of bias or competence. So understanding the constraints of an audit activity is key. I think a lot of people who think, oh, let's go and do an audit of our supplier, don't really fully understand some of those constraints. For instance, that second-party audits are usually of a limited time duration, and thus they are based on sampling. So any potential outcomes of an audit must be viewed from the sampling perspective. But it's generally held that a 5% sampling ratio provides a 95% level of confidence that the sample can be representative of the whole. It's also important when preparing and defining the objective of an audit to understand who are the interested parties. That can be internally to the organisation, for the most part it is, but sometimes there are external interested parties that need to have an understanding of what's going on. The parties could include the leadership of the organisation. There could also be other departmental areas and functional areas, say for instance purchasing or design, manufacturing, quality, or also potential departments that might need to be involved in planning the audit. We need to make sure that we're getting the scope right, that we're getting the plans right, because there is a cost in conducting an audit, specifically if it involves travel overseas. Oh, sorry, I skipped a slide. Then we need to think about the scope of the audit. What are we going to look at during this audit to obtain our audit objective? So the first step is to understand what the audit objective is. The second step is, okay, so we've decided we're going to do an audit. What are we going to look at during that second-party audit to make sure that we achieve our objective? So therefore, clarifying the scope It appears that it might be on the face of it to be simple, but in actual fact be complex and can have ramifications if it's not done correctly. For instance, making sure we understand what contractual requirements, if there are any, that need to be audited within that second party audit, not just the normal stuff that we look at, but are there any contractual requirements that need to be reviewed. And if the audit scope is not clearly defined, it can lead to an auditor venturing into an area that is outside of the intended scope, and thus the results will be impacted that, as the auditor might be looking at another customer's business at the supplier that might have very different requirements to the scope of supply that is in place between the customer and the supplier. Equally, we can erode that supplier relationship if we haven't got the scope correct, and I've seen that happen in the past. It's also important to determine who's going to conduct the audit. An inappropriate or incompetent, or rather an auditor with less than perfect competence, going to conduct an audit can also cause huge significant issues. So we need to make sure that the scope is also agreed with the suppliers. I'll talk to that in a moment. The next thing is we've decided we're going to conduct a second party audit. We've got clear objectives, we have a scope, we've got some criteria involved and expectations. We need then to communicate that to the supplier so they understand exactly what's going on. And we need to obtain agreement with the supplier, one that we can do an audit, and then potentially thinking about potential dates for scheduling. Names of auditors is important. Nationality of auditors can be very important. For instance, if there's defence contracts involved, overseas auditors who are not, for instance, a registered person in that country, if they're not a national citizen, they might be denied access to the supplier. There might be a need for non-disclosure agreements. There might be any security requirements that need to be understood. And also there could be specific requirements, for instance, for personal protective equipment in the way of hard hats, safety boots, safety glasses. A lot of suppliers will actually provide those, but nevertheless understanding what the requirements are ahead of time is also a good idea. When we're setting up and scheduling an audit, it isn't just going to be a one-act play. It's going to be iterative as more details become available. But usually keeping suppliers in the loop and informed rather than surprised usually results in a better audit result. No notice audits. Sometimes these happen when there is an auditor will suddenly show up at a supplier's site. Typically speaking, these don't happen very often in the normal state of affairs, but they can happen. And the thing to potentially realise is if we've got to the stage where we need to conduct a no-notice audit, where an auditor just shows up on site unannounced, there is usually a problem upstream in that there is potentially a question regarding the relationship between the customer and supplier, and that a breakdown might have occurred. So in essence, a no-notice audit is almost a last resort activity. And again, checking with the customer-supplier contract is very important to make sure you can do those. There could also be security issues. I'd refer you back to the previous slide that talked about non-disclosure agreements and nationality of auditors. The next thing we need to be doing is thinking about a checklist and also a draft audit plan. And to achieve the best opportunity for success of an audit, understanding the supplier's business operations will give you a greater chance of allowing that audit to proceed smoothly and to achieve your audit objectives. So understanding the customer journey through the supplier's organisation allows you to format a checklist, and I've used the word checklist in inverted commas in a reason, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Aligning that audit plan and the checklist through that customer journey. So understanding the flow of the supplier's processes is a vital part as well. And the checklist really should mimic the customer journey through their operations and also mimicking their processes. The audit objectives should be included in the checklist, i.e. what are we trying to achieve? But it's best if it's done covertly, and I don't mean that with any subterfuge. What I mean by that is actually having the questions being answered through the natural flow of the audit. Typically speaking, not asking a supplier a direct question is, how do you make sure you're compliant with this? That is not normally a very good question to ask, but it can be a last resort question if the answers haven't tumbled out naturally through the flow of the audit. Also, including the contract-specific requirements into the checklist should be a good idea. But it's very, very important that the checklist and indeed the audit plan should really rather be a compass for the audit and used to bolster the auditor competence and not replace it. I was doing an audit recently. We started off day one with revision 1 of the audit plan, and we ended the audit on revision 8, purely because we needed to change the running order of things and also availability of the suppliers' staff and other process works that were going on. Scheduling the audit. I maintain that 2 weeks is probably the absolute closest that you should be thinking about scheduling an audit. It's better still to be 4 to 6 weeks out, so that you've got time to arrange the logistics. The supplier is more comfortable. They can make any arrangements that they might need to get you admitted to the site, and also to line up the right people to help the audit go ahead. Show suppliers to the show flexibility to the suppliers as well. Some suppliers have to support multiple external audits. I was doing an audit a few years back, and there were 3 other customers on the site, as well as other auditors conducting audits to other standards. And typically speaking, it's best to avoid a Friday for an audit. And I don't mean that's because we're stopping people from going home. A lot of organisations actually only work a short day on a Friday. So if you're looking to do an audit that involves a manufacturing activity and there's no manufacturing going on because people have disappeared, really that's not going to help the audit objectives. But again, confirming the auditors, the nationality, the need for any non-disclosure agreements if there's any requirements, and finally also some organisations have online booking systems that if the auditor or a visitor is not registered ahead of the visit, it just takes longer to get the auditor or the person visiting the site access to the site. So the audit plan needs to be shared and changed as appropriate, but agreed with the supplier, hence why it's a draft, until the supplier has had input. So consider the supplier's input into the audit plan. But again, building flexibility into the audit plan and realising that plans frequently change is very important. If you have a plan and you stick religiously to it, the chances are that it's going to compromise the effectiveness of the audit that you're trying to conduct. It's always important that suppliers provide guides. They need to be knowledgeable in the customer's product requirements, as in what it is that the supplier is producing in the way of either a product or service, or products and services to the customer, and also have detailed knowledge of the supplier's way of working. If we're doing an audit and the guide doesn't know where things are done or how they work, it can actually take a lot more time to complete the audit if the audit actually is completable at all in the time frame. But usually good planning results in a favourable outcome of the audit. So we're now on, we've got everything arranged, we're on site, and hopefully we need to show up on time, and that's a common courtesy. If you're going to be running late, for whatever reason, traffic, flight delays, whatever it might be, let the supplier know, the supplier's representative know, so they're not starting to get worried about what's going on. Keep the communication going. It's common courtesy at the end of the day. And then conducting an opening meeting is a vital part as well, as it sets the auditor expectations. It allows people to introduce themselves to each other. We're confirming the scope of the audit and the methods that are going to be used, pointing out that it's an audit of the system and the processes, not of the people. Talk about flexibility in the audit plan. It's also worth absolutely stating that the mission of an audit is not to find fault. It is actually to gather information that demonstrates that the requirements are being met, otherwise known as evidence of conformance. You need to touch on safety, make sure that we get home okay at the end of an auditing day, and also confidentiality. That's a vital part, particularly if the supplier has got any proprietary processes in place. So we need to make sure that we touch on confidentiality, and that ties again into the non-disclosure agreements I previously mentioned. And there's altogether far too many subjects actually to be covered in an opening meeting or can be covered in an opening meeting. And I refer you to ISO 19011 and ISO 17021, which both contain guidelines for what can be covered in an opening meeting, conducting the audit, and also in a closing meeting. So some tips for effective auditing. Certainly there are as many different auditing styles as there are auditors, and none of them is absolutely right, but more than a few of them are wrong in my opinion. It's also subject to a webinar in and of itself. But typically speaking, effective open communication is absolutely the foundation for an effective audit. So stay objective and professional. It doesn't mean that you can't have a smile and a bit of a joke every now and again, because that just can take the tension out of any audit. So staying professional, focused on the evidence that you're finding. Don't dream things up. Don't talk in terms of opinions, but collect the evidence that you've got during the audit to make sure that actually you've got everything you know. Maintain an open communication with the auditee. Keep talking. Make sure that the auditee knows exactly what you're looking for, and how it's going. Keep those lines of communication open. One of the words I use, assume you're doing brilliantly unless I tell you otherwise. And that is just takes the tension out of the auditing process. Equally, it's important that you highlight any issues. So if you see an issue that you think is a problem, highlight it to the auditee there and then. Don't wait until the closing meeting, because you might be looking and interpreting something one way, whereas in actual fact in the supplier system, they're thinking in terms of very different things. If you're still finding that there's an issue despite all of that, after confirming the context and the accuracy of the issue, one of the tricks you can do is to expand the sample size to see if it's a one-off, the issue that you've seen, or indeed it's endemic everywhere through the organisation. Another thing or more things to consider when we're conducting the audit: don't touch anything. Particularly if you go near integrated circuits, if you're doing an audit of an electronics company, don't touch any integrated circuit, don't touch anything unless the supplier actually gives you the consent to do so, or you're invited to do so. Don't stray away from safe areas. Usually, most organisations have corridors marked by tape, sometimes on the floor or by some guide rails. Stay in the safe areas, again, unless you're invited to or with the supplier's consent. You are on an information gathering exercise. At the end of the day, that's what you're trying to achieve. You're trying to achieve and gathering that information. And one of the best ways of doing that is showing a genuine curiosity. Be interested in what people are doing. Because if you show that and you have a genuine interest in what people are doing, they're actually going to take their shoulders back, their chest out a little bit, and demonstrate the pride it is that they have for their work. Again, you've then got over a communication barrier. Do take sufficient notes, but remember, you're there to audit, not to write. We don't necessarily need war and peace in the way of an audit, but we do need to make sure we're gathering and taking sufficient notes to support a subsequent audit report or action list that we're going to be producing at the end of the audit. Stay within the scope. Is always a good idea. We talked about the scope earlier. Stay within that scope. Don't drift away from it unless it's absolutely necessary. Discuss with the auditor, debate with the supplier rather, but be nice. Have those discussions, but don't argue. Nobody likes an auditor, so it's always a good idea to smile. And if safety becomes a concern, discuss with the supplier or leave the facility altogether. Now we're moving on. We've conducted the audit. We've got some things that we need to write up. We've got some actions maybe that need to be taken, some opportunities that need to be written up. It is always a good idea to allow for some time in your audit plan to allow for a preparation for the closing meeting. You need to provide a cohesive closing meeting such that the auditee and the supplier can understand fully what it is that you've seen during the course of the day. If at all possible, prepare an action list there and then that you can share with the supplier to ensure that the context of any findings is understood. How you actually present the results of an audit can have a direct impact on the subsequent actions undertaken by the supplier. So take the time to do it right. Reporting and follow-up. The closing meeting, always say thank you. The auditee and the supplier have gone out of their way to allow you to conduct your audit, which could in fact have a disruptive effect on their business operations. So always say thank you for their hospitality and cooperation during the audit. When you're presenting the findings, talk to them. Don't just put them on a screen, but make sure that the supplier understands all the findings. They don't necessarily have to agree with them at this stage, but it is just making sure that they understand what you're seeing, and then discuss the findings with the supplier as well. It's always best as well to try to sell the findings, to explain why it's a good idea, not just because a standard says so or something along those, but why it's a good idea to allow the supplier to address those findings and how it's going to improve their management system, their processes, or indeed their compliance with requirements. Talk to the positive aspects as well. This is not done enough, in my opinion. It's very important to say, hey, you're doing brilliantly here. You might want to think about using that particular process over here, having another look there, so that you can actually build on those positive aspects. Then explain quite clearly if you have any findings, any non-conformances. Talk to the supplier about what your expectations are in terms of correction, root cause analysis, corrective actions, and implementation and effectiveness of those corrective actions. It's always best not to insist on a set time to resolve the issues. Some organisations say we want 10 days for a root cause analysis, or we want 30 days to close things out. Those arbitrary timelines might compromise the effectiveness of the response. I'm not suggesting you don't have timelines, but I'm just saying agree timelines as the investigation carries on. Also explain the expectations for an in-depth root cause analysis. There's something that's very badly done in nearly every organisation I've ever audited in 25 years is root cause analysis. So it's really important that you set your expectations for root cause analysis. And also explain in the spirit of partnership to the supplier that you are going to work with them to help resolve the problems, because everyone wins if the problems are solved in an effective way that improves the way the organisations function and indeed thus the supplier-customer relationship. It's always worth saying thank you again. So action lists and reports. I've seen many reports where the actual required actions that are being highlighted as a result of an audit can be buried in the report. So I think the best practice here is to make sure that actually you have an action list that's separate from the report itself, or have the action list as an annex to the report. It allows greater clarity as to what your expectations are in addressing any issues. The International Auditing Forum Auditing Practices groups espouse the use of the three-step non-conformance writing methodology. That is, capturing in writing what the requirement is, what the non-conformance is, and what the evidence is to state that it is in fact a non-conformity. If we're really clear with what the problem statement is, we can make sure that it helps the supplier implement effective problem resolution. And a badly worded non-conformance can be very, very counterproductive, particularly if there's a lack of clarity. Suggest the timelines, as I said, for responses, but be prepared to change as the result of investigations. If a root cause analysis, for instance, starts pointing towards a cultural issue within the organisation, that can take much longer to resolve than maybe 30 to 60 days. Sometimes that can go on for a year or more. Also list the opportunities and list the positive comments in the action list as well. And if possible, provide that action list to the supplier before you leave the facility. And if it's not possible on the day, then make sure you get it to the supplier as soon as possible so that they can recall the context of your findings. Action lists. Excuse me, quick drink of water. Again, I mentioned it earlier, but it's important to work collaboratively with the supplier along the problem-solving journey. It's best not to wait till the end when they suddenly X number of days later hit you with what they're going to be doing. if you then have a question about it. It's much better to apply a little rudder a long way from the rocks than a lot of rudder closer to the rocks, because time has passed and we've lost the opportunity to address the problems. And be open to refining those non-conformance statements. Again, it helps the supplier with their endeavours to solve the problem. Agree on the format of corrective actions methodology, whether it be 8D, Ishikawa, whatever it might be, A3 format. Just agree on a corrective action that works both for you and indeed for your supplier. And set milestone dates for the activities, but again, being flexible to change as investigation progresses. As I said earlier, be very clear about the expectations of the root cause. Make sure evidence of the correction that's actually put in place, and indeed also for the evidence that the corrective action to address the root cause has been implemented, and is not just implemented, but that it is effective. And look for data, look for agreed data that will demonstrate in agreement with the supplier that the implementation of that corrective action is going to work. And the old maxim here, teamwork makes the dream work, is absolutely true. Working in partnership with the supplier is fundamentally important to making sure they work with you collaboratively to enhancing that relationship. Audit reports. There are two customers of a second party audit report. The first one is the supplier. And yes, by the way, they might be a supplier, but when you pass on your report or your action list to them, they become a customer and you become the supplier. So bear that in mind. The organisation that also commissioned the audit is a supplier, is a customer of the second party audit report. So understanding their needs, and this ties back in to the purpose and the audit objective of what we're trying to do. But there's no right or wrong way to report on an audit, and it depends on the needs of the customers of the audit. That is the leadership of your organisation and indeed the suppliers. Saying thank you again is always a good idea. And also consider a high-level overview, an executive summary for those who are reading the report who might be a bit short on time. Can describe the role of the supplier in the organisation's process, i.e. what they do for you as a supplier, and include a statement as to the attainment of the objectives of the audit that were met, as in have we achieved the purpose of what we were trying to achieve, and also include whether those objectives and scopes of the audit whether they have been met, including that in the report. Also, make sure that in an audit report that you're referencing any specific regulatory or contractual requirements that you require on the supplier, and the attainment of complying with those requirements. It's also worth considering using a SWOT analysis to present the findings, as this typically is a better way to convey to leadership and management as to what the findings are, rather than necessarily in the terms of a non-conformance, say for instance to a discrete line in a standard. So present that SWOT. It will help management digest the audit report. Talk to the overall effectiveness in compliance seen during the audit. Include a summary of the day. Include a list of the people that you spoke to, and also include a statement confirming that the audit plan had been completed. Also, depending on the timing of the completion of the report, indicate whether any actions taken were effective. But it might be that you produce an audit report prior to confirming whether those actions are effective. And it can sometimes be worth issuing a second report, just updating it to confirm that the findings have been reviewed and are in fact effective. Keep them as concise as possible. We don't want War and Peace and Tolstoy in an audit report. Think about the people who are going to have to read it, but still keep the information that supports the audit, the objectives of the audit that have been met. Just a word on scorecards. I see a lot of scorecards in my work, scoring a supplier on the basis of an audit. The way that scorecards can be perceived as being an absolute, and they're not realising that the result is the score is a result of a sampling activity, and also the circumstances at play during at the supplier during the audit. So be a little wary of producing scorecards on the basis purely of a second party audit. Okay, so let's just talk for a quick moment the benefits of doing second-party audits, just to clarify them. If they're done effectively and in the correct spirit of collaboration, for the customer, that's the organisation commissioning the audit, they can improve a supplier quality and compliance across the board. It is a potential for that. Isn't a guaranteed, but it can contribute it if it's done properly. Can also reduce risks and costs associated with the poor performance within the supplier. If a supplier is not familiar with the risks that are open to the organisation that commissioned the audit, them understanding the risks, the supplier understanding those risks, can actually enable them to have to address them, perhaps when they weren't aware of them before. Again, it can strengthen the partnerships between the customer and the supplier. For the supplier, making sure that the expectations of the customer are fully understood. Sometimes a contract might not provide the full understanding of the customer expectations, the softer philosophy stuff. Equally, understanding what the culture of the organisation, the customer, understanding that philosophy and culture, and potentially letting them know what might be coming down the road at them in the next few years, can also enable the supplier to have greater understanding and position themselves accordingly. There is nothing like outside eyes to look at an organisation to identify areas of improvement. So that's another benefit if it's done in the correct spirit of collaboration that can come out of a second-party audit. So the opportunities are there for continuous improvement. Somehow it can also enhance the reputation and the business opportunities. So, for instance, if a purchasing organisation has given one contract or one purchase order supply to a supplier, if the audit report comes back and the audit is glows about the supplier's capabilities, well, the purchasing organisation might be willing to consider expanding that area of business. So therefore, their supplier's reputation is enhanced. And again, for the supplier as well, it underscores that partnership and the collaboration between customer and supplier. There are some challenges involved in these audits, second-party audits. Certainly, some of the ones I've seen is the resistance from suppliers. One of the concepts from, for instance, ISO 9001 years ago, it was to try to reduce the number of audits that the supplier has to entertain. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to have become a reality. So you can get pushback from suppliers in that they just don't have the time to support yet another audit, and that can come into resource constraints as well, whether they've got people available. As I said earlier, sometimes you can have multiple customers in an organisation at the same time, as well as being certification and other audits carrying on. Sometimes there can be cultural and language barriers. Certainly, it's something to understand when planning the audit. What is the language within the supplier, typically speaking? So that can be a challenge overcoming that. But again, forewarned is forearmed. And usually, certainly in my career, and I only speak English and badly at that, certainly language barriers can be a problem, but typically speaking, with the right approach and the right collaboration, those can become pretty insignificant. Audit fatigue, as I said, suppliers can have so many audits going on, they're just fed up with the things, and they just might not want to give you everything they need because it's another audit that we've got to host this week. There's also a fear of failure. In certification world, there's no such thing as failing an audit, because if we identify a problem, then we move forward. It's not quite the same with a supplier audit, a second-party audit. There can be a fear of failure if there is a real fear of a genuine failure, if the supplier is really not up to the mark. But I beg to suggest that would be more of a problem for the customer who chose to do business with the supplier in the first place. So a second-party audit, there can be a fear of failure. And again, finally, it can erode the customer-supplier relationship significantly. Put another line in here, yet another beating from the customer. So it can erode that supplier relationship, which might have taken years and years to build, and in one audit, that relationship just evaporates. But the best practices can result in, again, enhancing that relationship and trust with the suppliers. You can also use technology to streamline audits. So one of the things that you could consider is doing remote audits or hybrid version, sometimes on some parts of it on site, some parts of it remotely. A lot of suppliers for second party audits are very much open to that. And also focus on the positive. Don't go in there to find fault. Focus on the positive and work together with that client, with the supplier during that second party audit. Because if we win together today, we'll be hopefully winning and laying the road to success for winning in the future. So a quick summary takeaway from the of the audit. So they can be useful for improving compliance and reducing risks if they're done properly. The success of a second party audit depends absolutely on preparation, communication before and during the audit, as well as afterwards, effective follow through and with the correct attitude to make things better. The second party audit can also really enhance that customer supplier relationship by adding value to the supplier's business operations and in identifying areas of improvement such as process improvement and waste identification. But they are not without risks. Again, if there is taken years to build up a good customer supplier relationship, and if the second party audit is not conducted appropriately, which I have seen, it can actually really damage that relationship in the long term. Also, believe it or not, the customer, the supplier, the organisation commissioning the audit, if the audit is not conducted effectively, that organisation can actually suffer reputational damage as well. People tend to remember a bad auditor long after they've forgotten about a good one. So audit smart, build trust, and hopefully if you do it right, you're helping to improve the success of everybody all the way around. And with that, Rory, I think I'm back to you if there are any questions in the Q&A session.
Thank you, Richard. Really appreciate you taking the time to take us through that. If I can just remind everyone that there is the opportunity to ask our expert Richard any questions. We do have some questions that we can go through. So let me take you through the first one. So the first question, Richard, you emphasise the importance of understanding the supplier's business operations and integrating this knowledge into the audit structure. Could you expand and explain how auditors should effectively learn about the supplier's processes without being too direct? And if there's any specific strategies that auditors can use to gather this information, please?
That's actually a really good question. Obviously, conducting an audit using the flow of the customer's processes and their business operations is vital to understanding to achieving the objectives of the audit. Typically speaking, most of it is done before you actually show up on site. It's talking with the supplier, talking about what it is they do, understanding if they've got any process documentation and overall top level process flow. If they don't have such a thing in place, that's fine. Just have the supplier talk to you and write down the kind of processes, the steps, the customer journey that they go through the organisation. So, for instance, most organisations will have some kind of sales activity. There could be then a design activity. So then potentially a purchasing activity. So we're starting to see a flow. Then we start to maybe look at the warehousing and incoming inspection, or putting the goods away if there's no inspection, and then potentially, or even sometimes cross-docking, going straight from in case of just-in-time deliveries, going straight from the delivery vehicle to the manufacturing floor. So the understanding those, how you do it, again, it's part of the planning activity that needs to be undertaken prior to the audit actually starting. You shouldn't really be going out on site or visiting a client without an understanding. I mean, you won't be able to produce a good cohesive audit plan or indeed a checklist. Don't forget, a checklist is just a compass if you don't understand the supplier's processes. So those are typically my strategies I do when I'm preparing any audit, whether it be a third party, second party audit, understanding those, just asking the questions ahead of time to make sure things are clear. Certainly a top level process flow, if they have such a thing. They should have, if the supplier is certified, for instance, to ISO 9001, there should be a high level process flow that defines the processes, the sequencing and interactions. Obtaining that is how you potentially do it. However, sometimes you can go on site and see a picture that is a little bit different. But again, if you're starting to see, so a strategy for swiveling, shall we say, if the processes aren't the ones that you were led to believe, is to have a quick tour as part of the audit plan. So a quick 5-cent tour early in the audit, potentially after the opening meeting, when you're just literally walking through the organisation to understand how it flows. You might then need to rejig the audit plan and sometimes your checklist as well, according to that flow. So that having that little tour of the organisation, a facility tour as we call it, that can really help as well. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you, Richard. We have another one for you. So, Richard, you emphasised.
Keep me guessing.
Yeah, more questions. You emphasised that the discussing findings with the supplier and selling them. However, could you expand on how to handle resistance or pushback from the supplier? What should auditors do if the supplier strongly disagrees with a finding?
Another really good question. Thank you, Rory, and thank you to the person that submitted it. I think at the end of the day, what is of primary importance is that customer-supplier relationship. Deming in 1988, in one of his 14 points for management, talked about building long-term relationships with suppliers, and I think it's really important to focus on that. There will be occasions when you get pushback from the supplier, and typically speaking, it's best to play the long game and agree to disagree, or give the supplier the benefit of the doubt if there is any, shall we say, disagreement, unless you can actually prove it otherwise. But it's typically think of the long game, not the there and then. Think of the longer term, that longer term relationship. Certainly, if you're using the 3-step non-conformance writing methodology and you're doing it properly, those non-conformances cannot be questioned because they prove the non-conformance or issue actually exists. So again, that is writing what the requirement is. Now that might be a requirement from a contract, it might be a requirement in a purchase order, it might be a legal requirement, it might be statutory requirement, it could be a requirement against a standard, whatever it is that you're auditing, keeping it in scope, of course. But if you're using that 3-step writing methodology, actually the chances of there being any pushback from the client against issues are very, very low. When it comes to writing opportunities, simple as that, they are opportunities. You stress that there is not an absolute need for the supplier to act against those opportunities for improvement. But that's where selling comes in, really important. It makes sense. So, for instance, one of the things I see a lot in the audits I conduct is a phenomenal amount of waste in organisations, and I don't mean waste of people. I don't mean rubbish or anything along those lines. I'm talking about the 7 wastes identified by Taiichi Ono in the 30s. Actually identifying them and trying to then explain to the supplier the cost of that waste in real terms, and how little of the processes are truly adding value to what the customer is buying, actually can be really useful. But it's no good saying there's an opportunity to eliminate waste. That is going to be insufficient. You need to be able to talk to the supplier during your second party audit to explain the value in eliminating or reducing that waste, as a hypothetical example. Another one is root cause analysis, which is seldom done to any sufficient depth to identify the system-related issues. And again, explaining why it's a good idea to do a full root cause analysis. And sometimes I use the problems you had yesterday are still the same problems today, and they will be tomorrow because the root cause was never taken out initially. So selling those selling those findings helps with that pushback. If the supplier still is not playing ball, agree to disagree, and if it's possible, give the supplier the benefit of the doubt. Does that hopefully that answers the questions, Rory?
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Richard. I'm just keeping an eye on the clock. We've got. I think we can have one more question. Let me just. I know there have been some other questions today, and what we will do is we'll forward all these questions to Richard and ask him to kindly answer them, and we'll I follow up and reach out to everyone. I'll provide that answer. So let's go for one more question. Richard, it's been asked. You mentioned the importance of defining an audit scope and the risks of not doing so. Can you just expand on how to ensure the scope's defined correctly, if there are any concrete steps that should be taken to avoid scope creep or unintended audit areas?
There are, and perhaps, and that's another really good question. Testing me today. I've seen an organisation where an auditor was asked to do a second party audit. He was separate from the organisation commissioning the audit, and that person was trying to make a name for themselves by trying to find lots and lots of problems to report back to the customer when they were doing the supplier audit. The damage that did was absolutely massive to the reputation of the supplier to the customer, and it really did erode that relationship significantly. I then was privy to look at the report as part of a certification. I was privy to look at the report provided by that second party auditor, and it was abundantly clear to me that the auditor had drifted far away from the scope of any customer specific requirements related to his organisation, and he drifted off into looking at some requirements that were nothing to do with another customer, and he wrote quite a damning report based on information largely obtained through looking at processes and products that were absolutely nothing to do with the contract of supply between the supplier and the organisation commissioning the audit. Now, I'm not weaseling out of answering the question, but what I'm trying to is making sure we stay within the scope is a key thing. And I go back, understanding what that scope is again talking with the supplier, understanding what the contractual requirements are, understanding what the customer is doing for you and maybe doing for other people in general terms, so that actual fact we do stay within that scope of the audit without drifting off and causing problems that I saw in the example I've just recited that were still in place 5-6 years later, and very damaging indeed. So there's a lot there when it comes to understanding the scope, but again, that also includes making sure you understand any specific contractual requirements, what the processes you're going to be looking at are that contribute, that's to do with the organisation that commissioned the audit, and to stay within those parameters rather than drifting out if at all possible. Sometimes you need to get answers that are not necessarily something to do with that scope. And that's not so much of an issue, but you do need, and the supplier and the auditor do need to understand fully that actually that's outside of scope. It might just be used as an example to demonstrate compliance. But generally speaking, if it's outside of scope, you can't be writing it up. It's as simple as that. Hopefully that answered that question as well, Rory.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Much appreciated. I'm conscious of time. There has been a few more questions, but I think what I'd like to do is thank Richard for his time today and his expertise. What we'll then do is there has been a few more questions. We will follow up on those. I'd also like to remind everyone that if they want to take advantage of the a discount for our colleagues in Academy. They can use the code webinar, all one word, all lowercase, _1010, webinar _10. My contact details are on the page now, my email if anyone wants to reach out to me. So thank you for everybody attending, and have a great day.